Genesys Cloud functions provide a mechanism to extend architect capabilities beyond what is currently possible. This is very useful in certain cases where you would like to process data in a way that architect doesn't support, or if you need to call APIs in a way that data actions don't support. Basically, it allows you to write your own code that runs as a serverless function, call it as you would call other data actions, and then pass in an input and receive an output. To do that, the first step is to check permissions. This requires the typical interaction and integration and action permissions, as well as the action function permissions. So this permissions may need to be adjusted before you see this new integration and can configure it. To add the integration, you search for and add the function data actions integration and optionally give it a unique name. And as with other integrations, you can provide credentials. This allows you to specify distinct credential fields, and I'm going to use X API key as an example, the value of 1, 2, 3, 4. You could pass in a certificate or other unique value that you might need later on in your code. Integration credentials are stored securely in Genesys Cloud and cannot be read except at runtime by any other mechanism, even by Genesys support. So once you save these values, there is no way to retrieve them or to see what that value is after the fact, but you can configure and update them later. Once you've configured and saved your integration, then it needs to be activated. And this function is very similar to other data action integrations, but there's a little bit of difference in how you configure the data action. So I'm going to create a new data action and call it process regex, because I'm going to use as an example I've got to select my integration first. I'm going to use as an example processing a regular expression or using that to evaluate a string and return a substring, which architect currently doesn't have an expression for. Once I create my action, I define my name and contract. I'm going to add an input string, a regex expression, and an optional group. And you can always add description and notes to a property if you want to, and then an output string. And in the configuration, you can specify a custom body template if you want to. The default will be fine most of the time. You don't specify a URL because it has a hard-coded GUID. And once you're ready with your code, then you're going to configure the function. And so we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, the next step assumes that you have Node.js and the serverless package installed. You would install Node.js first, then use package npm node package manager to install the serverless package. And the first step is to create a new project based on the AWS Node.js template. So I'm going to create a new project, and let's call this process regex. This will create a new subfolder in the folder that I currently have open, in this case in VS Code. And this provides me with a few files, a git ignore if I'm integrating with Git, a YAML file that has configuration, and the JavaScript file that has your code. You can clean out a whole bunch of stuff. So you can clean out, if you want to clean up the YAML file, just about everything that is in the file, but basically everything that's commented. So you do need to have a few things defined. One is to update the runtime to the 2.0.x, though in my testing that didn't seem to make a difference on whether it functioned, at least for real basic stuff. you define functions, and we'll call this process regex. You define for your handler the path to the handler for this function. That path is going to be your JavaScript file and the export, the module that is exported. So for example, if I were to rename this file to index.js, and this would be process regex, then I would come down here and say index.process regex and save. Now you're also going to replace all of the code that is included as a default and extend the signature. So you will have the event, context, and callback. And in this case, I'm just going to copy paste in some example code that will allow me to process an input string using a regular expression, an optional group to select a capture group if one is specified, and then to return the final output string and handle any errors. The data action in Genesys Cloud will allow you to view the last 4 kilobytes of log events. So you can log to the console specific strings or events or information that's useful for troubleshooting. And that's really about the only way you can troubleshoot a function once you've uploaded it to Genesys Cloud. Once it's been packaged and uploaded as a zip file, you can't really do anything else. You can't even access it later on. You can only update it. So it's good to test locally and then package and upload and then test in Genesys Cloud. Now you can also add test data to your test scenario. So I'm going to create a test data folder, a couple of files in here. I'm going to add, first of all, just some test data and also some information for my context. And I can simulate data passed in through the event context in this file. So I'm going to put in some example data. And this would be my input values for the data action this will simulate those. And my context, I'm going to be simulating the XAPI key value that I saved to the integration, and this will be passed as a header from the data action from the integration credentials. We'll see that in a minute. And it has to be wrapped inside a client context object. Some of the stuff I just had to figure out with asking people in trial and error. It's not well documented yet. So now that I have a function that's exposed and the configuration to support it, I can run a couple tests. So in this case, I'm going to invoke this function locally and provide the path to my test data, both for the data for the event and the context. And this gives an error because I forgot to change directories to the new directory that was created. And of course, I also neglected to update the function name. I believe that's what we put. There we go. And you'll see now that my output string, based on the value that I provided for the regex expression, it had a couple of capture groups. My configuration indicated to return the first capture group, and so it returned a $. Value. So now that tells me that my function is working correctly and allows me to handle that. Now, one thing I didn't show here is if I wanted to handle something from the context, for example, and this is a bad example because I don't need to do this in my um, function here itself, but if I wanted to grab some information from the context, like that API key, and do something with it, I could add that logic. So in this case, I'm saying, if my API key value is 1, 2, 3, 4, allow it, or is not equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, log it, otherwise allow it to continue. Not important for this example, but just as an example of how to access the information from the event context. So now I need to package my event, and that will add a new folder to my project called .serverless, and will include a zip file. So now I can hop back over to Genesys Cloud, and I need to put the path to my event handler, and that is going to be the same path that I specified here. Select a runtime. I'm going to select the 2.0 to match my configuration. I'm going to select a file to upload. And I'm going to select that zip file that was generated as the package, upload it. That will be processed. That takes maybe 10 seconds or so to process. Save my data action as a draft, and then I should be able to run a test. So here's a string, here's some regex. I'm not going to specify a group. Run that, and it correctly outputs the value. So as a short version, that's how you set up a serverless function. Just as a note here, if I wanted to add that context, I could do x-api-key, and I would provide the reference to the credential field that I created on the integration. And this would be passed as a header that would show up in that. Go back here to my test data in the client context for the event, and those could be accessed then in my code to either use or branch the logic based on. So that is how you configure a serverless function in Genesys Cloud and access it. Once I were to publish it, then this data action could then be called from an architect flow just like any other data action.